Hello. Welcome to the Ready for Merge show, hosted by yours truly, Christine D. Kim. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the R4M Ready for Merge show. This is your third bi-weekly brief on all the important protocol changes happening on both Bitcoin Core and Ethereum. This is also the fifth official Ready for Merge episode in season one. Excited that the series is slowly but surely kicking along, continuing to progress. The topic for today's show is I have four main updates, two for Ethereum and two for Bitcoin Core. On the Ethereum side, I want to share some updates around the Fusaka upgrade as well as the Glamsterdam upgrade. And then for Bitcoin, I want to talk about the latest soft fork proposal that has gotten almost everyone in the Bitcoin community very angry. And then I also want to talk about a code merge that happened very recently into Bitcoin Core, a very important one, the C header API merge. So a bunch to get into on today's show. And I'm going to switch things up a little bit this time around and start with the Ethereum updates first. Because why not? And then we'll go into the Bitcoin updates. So let's get started with the Ethereum updates for today's show. The first is basically related to the Fusaka timeline. So my listeners of the Ready for Merge show should know that developers had tentatively set December 3rd as the mainnet activation date for the Fusaka upgrade. They had been saying this for a while, even before any of the Ethereum public testnets were upgraded. The intent was always to upgrade Ethereum mainnet before the end of the year and try to do it ideally like dodging the big Ethereum conference, which is happening in a couple of weeks in Buenos Aires, I think, in Argentina, in mid-November, but also dodge the holidays that are happening in late December. So very early on, they had thought of December 3rd as the mainnet activation date, and they had confirmed it just a couple of weeks ago. So through several calls, Ethereum developers have been announcing and sharing December 3rd as the mainnet activation date for Fusaka. Now, in order to meet that date, developers had also said client teams should get the final software for the Fusaka upgrade ready by November 3rd, which is 30 days in advance of the mainnet upgrade. This is one of the guidelines in the Ethereum protocol upgrade process document. This is a fairly new document in Ethereum's upgrade history, only been created, I think, since the last upgrade. But these are just guidelines to help Ethereum developers stick to a protocol that allows them to give the Ethereum ecosystem enough time to get ready for upgrades, make sure that the upgrades are activated on mainnet in as safe a way as possible. And one of those guidelines is that there should be a 30-day window buffer period between when final client releases go out and when the actual mainnet upgrade happens. So in accordance with that guideline, developers had agreed that November 3rd should be the day in which all the client releases are ready. And Ethereum has several clients. It has, I think, 12 clients, 6 on the execution layer and 6 on the consensus layer. Now, November 3rd was on Monday, 2 days ago from the recording of this show. And on Monday, developers were checking in with each other. Are you ready? Are you ready for the deadline of client releases? And most were not. It was unfortunate, but it also brought to light the issue that if client releases are not ready, if there isn't software for node operators in the Ethereum ecosystem to upgrade to, 30 days in advance, then should the mainnet activation date be pushed back? So that was a topic of discussion on Monday, and basically developers agreed that they would give themselves a couple of days leeway to catch up, to really meet the deadline, even belatedly by a couple days, and still be able to keep the December 3rd mainnet activation date. So that was the conclusion as of Monday. Developers are going to check in on this Thursday, tomorrow, and see if client teams have their final client releases ready. And if they do, they'll bundle all those releases into an official blog post put out by the Ethereum Foundation, and node operators can reference that blog post to see which clients, which updates, which versions of the client software they should be upgrading to. So I did a bit of sleuthing myself, because who wants to wait until Thursday tomorrow to really, get updated on literally everything. You want to stay. This is my full-time job, so I'm just lurking in all the client team discords. And good news is that most Ethereum clients have put out their releases in the last 2 days, in the last 48 hours. The only two clients that I believe have not yet put out their releases for the Fusaka mainnet upgrade is the Nethermind client and the Prism client. So when you think about it just by number, having only two clients that haven't met the deadline is actually pretty good. However, these two clients are major ones. They are clients that a significant percentage of the Ethereum node operator community, it's the software that a lot of node operators rely on. So for Nethermind, it's something around 40% of node operators is estimated to run Nethermind, and for Prism, it's around 20%. So definitely the Ethereum mainnet upgrade cannot happen without them. However, I will note that on the Prism side, at least, the Prism team had shared quite early on, actually, even before this week, before Monday's call to check in about client team readiness. They had said last week that they had unexpectedly found a bug in their software that they are investigating and trying to work out, and that this bug is not a bug that they think they'll be able to resolve in time for this week. So what Prism developers were saying is that it's very likely that team will only be able to release a release candidate version of their final Fusaka mainnet client, meaning that this version will not be the final version for the Fusaka upgrade. So they'll put out kind of like an experimental, a release that still needs testing, and a couple days or a week after, they'll put out the final version. And other Ethereum developers on the call in which Prism was sharing this news last week, which was on last Thursday, developers were they were in agreement that even if Prism's final client software is not ready, they should still move ahead with the December 3rd mainnet activation date. And between now and December 3rd, Prism can release their final version, and that node operators can just upgrade to it a little bit later than perhaps other node operators who are running other clients. And so one thing I just want to highlight and stress for node operators is, if you are running Prism, you do have to be very attentive to when the final client release for Prism comes out. Do not run the release client and think that you're all done. You have to make sure that the version that you're running is the final version. And even if that version is posted on the release candidate is posted in the blog post, I don't know how developers are planning on the communication around this, but they should, at least in their blog post, put a little asterisk that the release candidate is not the final candidate, not the final version that node operators should be running. Node operators just need to be aware that there is still a release coming that they'll need to upgrade to in time for the Fusaka mainnet release. It's not ideal by any means. I think that the ideal situation is that all the final client software releases are packaged into one blog post, and node operators have the full month, have the full 30 days to upgrade, and to even test out some of these final versions on the test nets, the public Ethereum test nets. But that's not the situation. C'est la vie. Developers are certainly prioritizing speed with the Fusaka upgrade, more so than I think they have in other upgrades. They are not. I think they are very comfortable with relaxing many guidelines around what constitutes a safe mainnet upgrade in order to meet this deadline, in order to meet the objective of upgrading Ethereum mainnet before the end of the year. And so much so that I think this has definitely caused some alarm among certain Ethereum developers. I was just sharing kind of the TLDR from Monday's testing call on X, and I was talking with Lodestar developer Phil, who was also sharing that he might be bringing up some concerns around how quickly developers are moving through the final testing process for upgrades, especially as it relates to the time period between public testnet upgrades. So Ethereum ran through Fusaka quite quickly on the Huleshki testnet, Sepolia testnet, Hudi testnet. And for the Hudi testnet in particular, I think there were a few bugs discovered in clients that client teams just have not yet had sufficient time to react to. And so one other thing that I'll note related to this is that all node operators, not just Prism, should be very attentive to last-minute bug fixes, last-minute hotfix releases that come between now and the December 3rd date. Already, the Geth team has also put out a little bit of a hot fix to their mainnet release. I think that happened just within a few hours or maybe a day after they had released their final version. The Nethermind team had shared on Monday that, yes, they'll have a release ready for this week, but very likely they're also working through some unexpected regressions in their node that they'll have to release a hot fix for. So it's not ideal, but testing in clients is going to be ongoing between now and December 3rd for the Fusaka mainnet upgrade, and node operators really have to stay alert for the release that they need to run, and just be very mindful of last minute updates. And hello, Kadigo. I hope I said your name right. I'm looking at the chat a little bit as well for people that are tuning into the live stream, which is great. I love it when people tune in for, the real action. As you know, these episodes will be, they'll be slightly edited and put into, uploaded onto all podcast channels after the live show. But if you tune into the live show, you get the non-edited, the raw cut. So yeah. Anyways, so that's the update on Fusaka. Node operators, please stay alert. Ethereum node operators. Glamsterdam, we're still on Ethereum updates. I'll notify and do a little break in the show when I move on to Bitcoin. I have one more update around Ethereum protocol development, and that is the Glamsterdam scoping discussions. Now, Ethereum developers have put out a pretty extensive timeline for how they want the Glamsterdam scoping discussions to go, and as per usual, things don't go according to plan and the timeline, because some of these things are not easy to guess exactly when things are going to happen, like when consensus can be formed by a decentralized group of stakeholders. Basically, Ethereum developers had said October 30th, which was last Thursday, is the deadline for all proposals, all Ethereum improvement proposals that want to get in and be considered for the Glamsterdam upgrade. And this Thursday, so tomorrow, November 6th, is the deadline for when client teams should have reviewed all the EIPs and have put in their submissions or shared their opinions about what should the EIP shortlist be for Glamsterdam. Now, there's obviously a lot of work going on the Fusaka side to get the client releases ready, testing ongoing for Fusaka, and it's unclear if there's a lot of client teams who have had the time to really review all of the EIPs, especially because there seems to have been a bunch of EIPs that were submitted a little bit last minute after the deadline of last Thursday. There are now over 40 Ethereum improvement proposals that are up for consideration for the Glamsterdam upgrade. And mind you, anyone can submit an EIP, literally anyone from the Ethereum community or non-Ethereum community. And there are very helpful EIP editing sessions to show and teach people how to format your proposal in a way that will make it more likely for inclusion and consideration. Those are hosted by the Ethereum Cat Herders group. Highly recommend going to these EIP editing office hours in case anyone's interested. But apparently the deadline is passed, so maybe for a future upgrade. However, it does seem as though a couple of EIPs have been kind of added last minute. It could have been those EIPs that were that stakeholders had shared their intent to propose, and now they've really formalized the proposals and they've been added into the hard fork, the Glamsterdam hard fork meta EIP, and that's the kind of formal official tracker for all the proposals. All this to say, there's 40 and there's a lot. And so one of the developers had shared in the Ethereum R&D Discord, which is just like a public kind of chat room where a lot of Ethereum developers coordinate their work and coordinate Ethereum upgrades. Bezu developer Justin Florentine was sharing that it does not seem likely or feasible for at least his team to be getting in their opinions about what should be going into the Glamsterdam fork by tomorrow. And he requested kind of a week extension to just allow for more time. And I have a feeling like that is going to be well received by other client teams too. So Glamsterdam scoping discussions are ongoing. And I will say there is a really helpful tool if my listeners haven't already noticed this tool called Forkcast. And Forkcast will allow the broader Ethereum community, even people that don't join in on the developer calls or who are not active on the Discord, to just share their preferences of what they'd like to see in the Glamsterdam upgrade. So of all the EIPs that have been proposed, if there's a few that you as a stakeholder would want to champion and want to signal your support for, check out the Forecast tool. It's quite intuitive and quite easy for people of non-technical background or people that are not really in the loop usually in the loop of developer kind of discussion forums to just use, really easily pick up and make your voice heard. 2 EIPs very quickly. Oh, honestly, time really escapes me on this show. Okay, very quickly, 2 EIPs that I think will likely get into Glamsterdam. So as a refresher, there's already 2 that developers are working on. These are the headliner EIPs, the biggest features that are going to be included in Glamsterdam. One of them on the consensus layer side is Enshrine Proposer Builder Separation. It basically changes block validation on Ethereum to be more scalable and efficient. It separates the consensus validation of the block from the execution payload validation of the block. A little bit technical. I'm not going to get into it in this episode, but maybe a future episode. That's on the consensus layer side. And on the other side, there's block level access lists, parallelizing transaction execution. So that's already in the work. Those are developers are working on them. The block level access list falls close to being ready for a multi-client DevNet launch for testing. But of the 40 that developers are still trying to suss out, I think on the consensus layer side, EIP 8045 is quite likely for inclusion. It's a really simple code change and kind of a minor fix that it would harden and make Ethereum more secure in the event of non-finality. In the event that a lot of validators are slashed, i.e. like forcibly exited from the network for breaking the rules of the protocol, the consensus rules of the protocol. In that event, this would be an EIP that's quite helpful to ensure that there's not too many missed blocks on the network in those cases. On the execution layer side, I think there is a subset of gas repricing EIPs that are very likely for inclusion. As a bit of a background on gas repricing, every single operation, every single on-chain activity that happens has a certain gas price. Gas is units that measure the computational work required for nodes to execute that operation. So if you send a transaction, that costs a certain amount of gas. And there are certain operations that are simply overpriced on Ethereum that need to be lowered. There are other operations that are underpriced and need to be adjusted for how much computational work it requires for nodes to execute on chain. And what's interesting is that for every single block, there's a total block gas limit. So if developers lower the gas price of a certain operation, more of that operation can be processed in a single block, and just more accurately allowing operations to reflect the computational resources that are demanded on nodes every time those operations are processed by the network. It allows developers to fine-tune scaling on Ethereum to know more accurately. If we increase the block gas limit, these are the operations, or this is how much more computational resources it'll require to process that block. So a pretty major change, and it's not just one code change. There's several opcodes, several different operations that could be repriced. It's a bundle of, I believe, about 10 EIPs, of which only a subset of them will likely be included into Glamsterdam. One note around gas repricings, not gas repricings in particular, but on the block gas limit. With Fusaka, there is a block gas limit increase upcoming. So as node operators are already starting to upgrade their software to the final Fusaka releases, the default of your block gas limit will automatically increase from 45 million gas to 60 million gas. So that's something to be aware of, all Ethereum stakeholders, L2s, node operators. When you're running the new Fusaka mainnet release clients, your node will automatically be signaling to the network that the block gas limit can and should be raised higher to 60 million, which again just means more operations, more transactions can be processed at any single given time in the Ethereum blockchain. So please take note of that change that will happen anytime between now and the actual Fusaka mainnet activation date. So there you have it. That is the Ethereum updates. And I have literally maybe 10 minutes for Bitcoin. This happens literally all the time. But I'll get better at pacing myself slowly over time with these shows. So Bitcoin updates. Let's move right along to Bitcoin updates. The first update that I have for my listeners since we last talked 2 weeks ago is that there has been a bit of a kerfuffle again in the Bitcoin community around a soft fork proposal that would limit arbitrary data from being stored on chain. And I had said in my prior episodes that all of this drama around arbitrary data being stored on chain is likely to die down. I did say that, die down, or at least that it'll come to kind of a head, come to a conclusion with the V30 release, because node operators are really required to kind of make their choice of where they stand on the issue and which release to run. But when the V30 release went out, it's true, node operators were signaling through their actions rather than through their words what they wanted. As that was happening, there was a discussion around limiting the script pub key size. This didn't have much to do with the op return debate, the V30 release. Basically, there was a soft fork proposal that suggested in the field where users are defining the rules for spending their Bitcoin, which is the script pub key. Let's limit the size of that to prevent anyone from making too large of transactions. This was more of a change that wasn't trying to limit arbitrary data on the blockchain, but just simply limit its use in this specific part of a transaction that was designed to really just be a part of the transaction, the script pub key that defines strictly the rules for spending Bitcoin. So there was discussion about that proposal and why it would work and why it wouldn't. And within that discussion thread around limiting the script pub key size, Luke Dash Jr., who is the maintainer of the alternative Bitcoin Knots implementation and a strong critic of Bitcoin V30, Bitcoin Core V30 release, he mentioned, well, if we're going to make this change, or if this proposal is something that core developers want to do, why not just introduce a bunch of these other rules that will completely restrict arbitrary data being stored on the blockchain in all these other ways? Again, that wasn't really the intent of the limited script pub key size discussion. However, his proposal, Luke Dash Jr.'s proposal of just going the extra mile, ended up becoming a pull request, a formal Bitcoin improvement proposal to truly limit arbitrary data from being stored on chain. This PR was opened by a Bitcoin contributor who I don't believe anyone really knows who this person is, or at least he's not kind of like this person. I say he, but who knows? The screen name they used was Dathan Ohm. Not much known about him or his contributions to the Bitcoin community, but he opened this PR to just push forward this new soft fork proposal, and there was quite a bit of controversy around that soft fork proposal. It didn't get very far, though, mainly because upon closer inspection of this proposal, Bitcoin Core developers and other community members noticed quite a few significant security flaws in that proposal. Pretty serious ones that would incentivize miners to potentially double spend, purposefully extend two versions of the same chain, and before exchanges really are able to commit to which chain is the longest or the canonical Bitcoin chain, allow these miners to like double spend and destabilize the protocol. And so I think for that main reason, the proposal didn't quite materialize into anything more. This was really the controversy, I would say, not last week, but the week before. There were conversations from people that are still very strongly against V30 in the Bitcoin community, the Bitcoin Core V30 release that recently went out. That there's going to be a new version of Dathan Ohm's soft fork proposal that does address all these security concerns and that will be a lot more robust. Now, I think there is a possibility that that new version of the proposal is already out, but I'm not sure. And I also think that a lot of the traction that initial proposal had gotten has since died down quite a bit. Part of it is because it is a little concerning to be, championing a BIT proposal, a Bitcoin improvement proposal that has clear security flaws, and that is what happened. But also, the Bitcoin Core V30 release itself has actually picked up quite a bit of adoption and gained more traction since its initial release. There were some data to show that the Knots implementation that rejects the op return data carrier size limit change, that rejects that part of the V30 release. There was some initial data right after the release, the V30 release, to show that Knots adoption is pecking up, but since then the data has since flipped over, and now apparently Bitcoin Core V30 has flipped Knots in terms of popularity. As a side note, I think it's kind of the science behind tracking different Bitcoin implementations through labeling of nodes is a bit hard, because not all nodes on Bitcoin, on the Bitcoin network, are publicly identifiable. And then there's also certain mistakes that can be had with labeling the versions that nodes are running. But anyways, there seems to be less traction since Bitcoin Core V30 seems to be picking up more adoption. And then, of course, this concern around the clear security flaws that were in the initial soft fork proposal of Dathanome has definitely reduced a lot of the popularity for it, because neither Knots nor Bitcoin Core, nor really any Bitcoin stakeholder wants to destroy or destabilize the value of the Bitcoin protocol. Above all, like that should be at least the, I don't know, the one thing that all stakeholders can agree on, which is why I think this proposal, this soft fork proposal by Dathanome has not really gone anywhere and will not really go anywhere. So yeah, that's the TLDR on the soft fork hubbub that you may have been seeing on X, and maybe tail ends of still on X, and other Bitcoin discussion forums. Now, I have an exciting update around Bitcoin development in the last very few minutes of today's show, and that is about a real actual code merge that was merged into Bitcoin Core that is significant, and that is truly the purpose of why I even started this series, to cover important ways in which the Bitcoin Core protocol and Ethereum protocol are evolving. Yesterday, that's right, so recent, yesterday, Tuesday, November 4th, the C header API was merged. This is part of a larger project of Bitcoin Core, called the Kernel Project, or the Kernel Working Group. These developers are trying to extricate Bitcoin's consensus code from all the other aspects of the protocol that are not necessary for validating blocks and validating transactions on Bitcoin. So if you heard my episode around the controversy of the Bitcoin Core V30 release, you'll know that a lot of the controversy is actually around a default setting in the Bitcoin Core node that changes which transactions are relayed and propagated through the peer-to-peer Bitcoin network. But it doesn't actually impact the validity of those transactions. And so changing that default setting is not a consensus breaking change. It is not a soft fork. It doesn't restrict or constrain the rules of consensus. So there are several aspects of Bitcoin Core, the software, that it's not important to maintaining consensus, for your node to maintain consensus and stay on the same chain, the same protocol as other users that are running implementations of Bitcoin Core. And for the longest time, it has been extremely hard to extricate what is consensus critical and what is not in the Bitcoin Core code base. Side note, when I say Bitcoin Core code base, there's actually two technically in the GitHub repository. So there's actually a Bitcoin Core GitHub project where there is very clearly like separated from Bitcoin Core implementation, client implementation. There's like these ancillary like tools and resources for running the Bitcoin Core client that's hosted in the Bitcoin Core project. But there is a Bitcoin Core Bitcoin client implementation on GitHub, and the project is Bitcoin. It's just Bitcoin/Bitcoin. And very recently, there was a discussion around, well, like Bitcoin Core developers should rename their client repository to a different name, because now people are confused around whether the Bitcoin Core client is the Bitcoin protocol. And while technically it's not, while Bitcoin Core client is technically not the Bitcoin protocol, it does, for the longest time, it has defined the Bitcoin protocol. And for any non-Bitcoin Core developer, anyone who isn't familiar and well-versed as a Bitcoin Core developer, it would be very hard for them to identify in the Bitcoin Core client what is consensus code and what is not. And so historically, it has not been very easy for developers, third-party, non-core developers to develop their own alternative implementations of the Bitcoin protocol. And for all intents and purposes, Bitcoin Core remains the most widely adopted client and is just, and can be, I feel like for all practical purposes, can be thought of as Bitcoin protocol. There are certain code changes that are merged that are not that are optional and not really core to the Bitcoin Core protocol. However, there are others that do impact consensus, like the soft forks that are, again, if Bitcoin Core doesn't implement it, then it's not likely to be adopted by the rest of the network because most of the network runs Bitcoin Core. Anyways, let's get back to the actual merge. So now you know the backstory of how difficult it is to identify what is consensus code and what's not. The C header API and the whole point of the kernel project is to extricate the consensus code and make it very clear what is consensus code and what is not. This is a multi-year effort led by several Bitcoin Core developers. And very recently, there has been a merge of the very first API that anyone can interact with directly to interact with and to check consensus code of Bitcoin without and check the validity of transactions and blocks without running the entire Bitcoin Core node implementation. So it's cool that now there is this tool, this API that Bitcoin stakeholders and Bitcoin developers and community members can run to check and to verify the consensus critical code of Bitcoin separate from the rest of Bitcoin Core nodes and software without having to run the full Bitcoin Core node. So there you have it. That's a new merge, like a new feature in the Bitcoin Core code base that I think is so important to the future long-term neutrality of Bitcoin Core as an implementation, because they've made this decision and have this ongoing effort, really. I mean, the API is great, but, there's still more steps to be needed to really flesh out the consensus code of Bitcoin from Bitcoin Core. But it's this is an important milestone of that will allow Bitcoin Core to be more neutral because it very clearly it's easier to define in the code base. Okay, what is consensus code that's critical for Bitcoin protocol and what is not, and what is just simply Bitcoin Core features that other implementations do not need to have the same features as. So I hope that this will really encourage client diversity on Bitcoin. I'd love to see new client implementations of Bitcoin that are not just copycats of Bitcoin Core with just a few lines change, that have real resources, real teams behind them, long-term support for. I think that would be just so healthy for the decentralization of Bitcoin and the Bitcoin protocol, add more resiliency. So if you're interested in learning more about this API and trying it out, if you are a developer and you care about the world's most valuable open source technology, open source protocol, please check out this new API written in C. It is PR30595. I will link to it in my show notes for today's episode. I'll also link to a bunch of other links to anything I've talked about in today's episode. So if you're interested in learning more, please do go check out the show notes. 3 other things on the back end of today's show that I just want to highlight. As my listeners know, next week will be another guest episode. This time, however, instead of me choosing what I think is most relevant, I'd love for my listeners to share with me which Meet the Devs profile would you like to listen to the most. We have about 5 left in the archive. You can find them on my Substack, which I'll link to in the show notes as well. This is like the fifth, I would say. Yes, it is the fifth Ready for Merge episode by now. Hopefully, I've got a lot of recurring listeners. I'd love to engage with you. I'd love to hear more about what you think. So, very pointed question. Let me know which of the Meet the Devs episodes you would like to hear the most next week, and whichever one has the most consensus or most of my listeners want to listen to, that's the one I'm going to publish. So, ideally, comment or share on X or YouTube, wherever you're getting this, which one you'd like to see. Third, please, if you like the episode, be sure to subscribe so you get notified of new episodes. And finally, if you think this episode could be helpful for or useful or interesting to anyone in your circles that too want to learn more about the evolution of Bitcoin and Ethereum, please be sure to share the show with them. So yes, there you have it. You are now officially caught up on what's ready for merge in Bitcoin Core and Ethereum. Thank you all so much for listening. I will talk to you all again in 2 weeks, and stay tuned for the Meet the Devs episode coming out next week. Thank you. Bye, everyone.